Hello, everybody. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Carl Jung, and this is because today in the morning I was reading, and I kind of feel like Carl Jung is yelling at me, scolding me, basically because he talks about when you think that you know something, you become kind of cocky, right? You become like this know-it-all person, like, oh yeah, now I have the solution, and that's also part of your neuroticism or your neurotic disease, right? So he talks about how there are basically like two poles, two extremes that are always manifesting in people, either one or the other. Like, for example, you can feel superior or you can feel inferior, right? You can feel like a good person or you can feel like a bad person, right? Or you can feel like you're virtuous or like you have vices, right? Now, virtues and vices, well, first let me say that either one of these extremes is bad, um, because what you really need and what Carl Jung ultimately talks about is the integration of the shadow, individuation, which is basically coming to terms with who you really are as a whole, whether you're good, part bad. And he talks about the collective unconscious, and how like learning is actually becoming more collective, right? Which kind of makes sense if you think about it. When you learn something, you're becoming more with the all the collective. But it gets a little bit confusing because then you have your personal unconscious and your personal consciousness, and it's kind of like, I kind of think about it like through steps. Like your personal conscious is like the outermost you, and then it's like your collective conscious, which is like people, right? Or maybe that's the most extreme, and then it's your personal conscious, and then it's like your personal unconscious, and then it's the collective unconscious, right? Which ties into everything basically. um, and I don't know why I'm noticing like that I'm speaking like on this side, and it's kind of distracting me like with the ear. But anyway, so all of these things, like these extremes, inferior, superior, good, bad, virtuous, and having vices, um, Carl Jung basically says that they're all the same thing. They're all illusions, right? They're not real because you can't really be completely inferior, completely superior, completely good, completely bad. You can't have virtues, right, and vices. And let me just kind of define this in my own terms. Virtue are like things that people say are good things and that are constantly repeated. Like, for example, if you're a very nice person, if you like to help people, if you exercise, right? Like they say nowadays, if you eat healthy, if you sleep early, right? If you get your 8 hours of sleep, if you have positive thoughts, like all of these are virtues, right? And vices are like the opposite. Like if you smoke, if you drink, if you swear, if you're aggressive, if you're mean to people, if you're anxious, if you're depressed, right? Like all of these things would be vices, right? Now, what kind of made me want to make this video is that I was thinking of that, specifically virtues and vices, and I was like, well, it's kind of like when people say you're stubborn or you're determined, right? Like they're the same thing. What distinguishes a virtue from a vice? Because ultimately we're talking, both of them, we're talking about routines or habits, right? They're things that you do regularly and religiously, right? So what would be the difference between a virtue and a vice, right? Like the Greek philosophers would basically talk a lot about virtue, right? They would advocate for virtue, like you need to be virtuous, right? Virtue would even be like the ultimate goal of Greek philosophers. I think at one point they mentioned this, like the ultimate goal of mankind or of humans is to be virtuous, right? To be flawless, to be perfect, right? To be morally uncorruptible, etc. So, what's the difference? First of all, I have two differences that I thought of like basically on the spot. The first one is moral perception. So, it's how people view these things, right? Like, let's say you do something routinely, and people see that that's bad, or people think that's bad. They're gonna say it's a vice, right? Like, let's say you like to gamble or you like to bet, and you do this like every weekend. You bet on your favorite sports team, you lose money, and people are gonna start saying, oh, that's a vice, that's a bad thing, like you should stop doing that. But now let's say you get a bike and now you go biking every weekend, right? And it's like doing exercise. So people see that and they're gonna say, oh, that's a virtue, like that's a good thing, keep doing it, right? Virtues keep doing, vices stop doing them, right? That's basically the difference. Now, of course, the moral perception is subjective, right? It's very, by subjective, I don't mean that it's not effective or it's not well defined or it's not something that is real, because I know it's real. Like if you're doing something harmful repeatedly, it's probably going to get you sick. And if you're doing something healthy repeatedly, it's going to make you healthy or healthier, right? I'm not saying that's not wrong, but a lot of things are based on basically common sense or public domain stuff, right? Where people, basically how people view things is how they are, right? And you could think about that and say, well, this person, like let's say a teenager that really likes to play basketball, right? Like in High School Musical. So this guy really likes to play basketball, but his parents think that he should go to college and study a career, right? And they see basketball more as a hobby, but then eventually if the teenager starts to like really get into basketball and he really wants to do something with basketball, the parents are going to see that as a vice because it's harmful, right? But what if he gets really good and then eventually that really turns into a virtue, and then 40 years later he's getting inducted into the Hall of Fame and he's thanking his parents and his parents are so proud of him when at first they didn't believe in him, right? So it's like that's the subjective arena that for me is kind of like, morality has changed throughout the years, right? Throughout the cultures it's different, so it's not really in the culture that you live in it's defined, but in other cultures and other times it's different. It was different, right? Okay, now second of all, there is a benefit aspect to I forgot what I was talking about. To virtue, yeah, to virtue and vice. Like and I think there's a benefit aspect to what's good, right? I made a video analyzing good. Go check that out. But basically it's based on others and yourself and on the benefit or non-benefit that you can get or not get, right? Like for example, if you say, well, I'm doing something and it's benefiting me, right? Or it's benefiting others, then it's a virtue. And by benefit I mean that it's like adding, right, something valuable, or taking away things that aren't valuable, right? Like helping people, I don't know, like mow their lawn, or helping them like with a charity type of event, right? So these type of things are gonna define virtue or vice. If they're harming others, which would be the opposite of benefit, right? Or if they're taking things away from other people or from yourself, then they're basically that would be the difference, right, between virtue and vice. Like if they're taking things away from others or yourself, or harming others or yourself, then it's a vice. But if they're giving things, if they're adding value to you or others, then it's a virtue. Now in analyzing good, I talk about how this can get complicated because something can benefit you, but that means it's going to harm others, right? And then we get into like moral dilemmas of like, is that right? Or it can benefit others but harm you, right? Or benefit others at the expense of yourself, right? Or benefit some people, but that means harming other people, right? So it gets a little bit tricky there. So that would be the other difference. Now, there's this idea of define the difference, which is, if you think about it, something that kind of makes your thoughts stop. Like, what do you mean define the difference? And in this case, I kind of came to this idea, this notion of like, maybe it can apply here because by defining the differences between the two, and again, this is something that Carl Jung would probably say, like, no, you're just crazy. Like, don't talk about those extremes. Like, what you really need is balance between the two things. But I do it anyway because I want to like experiment between these or kind of think about these two ideas. Defining the differences in this case is something that will help you to learn more things. Right now, I don't necessarily know if learning is a good thing because, the tree of knowledge, or taking from the tree of knowledge, or evil is knowledge, right? Like those biblical ideas where, Adam and Eve, when they took a bite of the apple of the tree of knowledge and they learned about good and bad, that's when and whenever people talk about good and bad, it is a very controversial topic because biblically speaking, or religiously speaking, it's something that humans shouldn't really touch. It's something that humans don't know how to handle, right? They get confused. People get confused when we talk about good or bad, right? And that's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it stimulating. So by define the difference in this case, if you define the differences between the two, again, it's going to help you learn things. But in this case, I'm also talking about this idea of how you can learn about yourself when you differentiate yourself from others, right? Like if you notice this person is doing this, right? Like Carl Jung talks about, if you see someone doing something and then you have two options. Basically, you have, well, three options. The first option is don't do anything. The second option would be to act like them, and the third option would be to act like the opposite of them, to act different, right? So in a way, a therapist was telling me, you kind of distinguish yourself from that based on that, right? Based on the differences, you're able to kind of like distinguish yourself and define yourself in a different light, and hence you're able to learn, right? But there's another interesting idea, which is that if you actually approximate people, you unite to them, you can make contributions, and those contributions are new contributions that you're coming up with as you're interacting with others. And that's also something that can help you grow, that can help you develop. So you can develop both ways, you see. You can develop by differentiating yourself, or you can develop yourself by simulating, by being similar to them, right? And this will help you basically grow and develop through others, right? Now, Carl Jung was also saying that contradictions such as virtue and vice aren't apparent until we grow. Because when we grow, that's ultimately when we detect these contradictions and we have to make decisions about the person that we want to be. Do we want to be virtuous? Do we want to feed our vices, right? And that's kind of like the idea here. I wanted to say a little bit more about define the difference, but it is a very complicated idea. I've spoken on this before, but what do you think about define the difference? Because basically it's taking these ideas and by, saying like inferior, superior, good or bad, virtue and vice, you're able to, they talk about degrees, right? You have degrees. It's not that it's good or bad, it's just that they are degrees, right? And defining these things so clearly kind of complicates things because it really leaves no room for alternatives or for other ways of perceiving things, like more gray area, right? Like it's either bad or good, and that's not really the case, right? So they talk about degrees. So if you're going to define the difference between the two, I guess that would be a little bit complicated, right? So let me know what you think about this, and that's all I got for this video. So I'll see you in the next one, right? Peace.